Hello, welcome to Clickbait, and today I'm going to be talking about a slightly unusual lens, the Nikon 19mm PCE, or Perspective Control Electronic, or Tilt Shift lens. And this is an expensive oddity at that, and as a lot of its features can sort of be replicated in post, why bother with something like this? Especially in the shoot fast, process later world, being forced to stop with a tripod seems like an anachronism, but the quality from a lump of glass like this can seriously outclass the digital fake. Now, there aren't really many options in the tilt shift market. Lensbaby makes some kind of toy-like ones, and Samyang do a 24mm for Sony and most of the other major mounts. But only Nikon and Canon actually do a full range of these things, and this is Nikon's widest, the 19mm. Now, architectural and interior photographers no doubt will already be familiar with this kind of thing. They can be used for two ways. And the idea is that you can use the shift element to control perspective by literally shifting the front element the same way as on a plate camera. So you set your camera back vertical, the same as the building, for example, you're shooting, and then the front element of the lens moves up or down, or even left to right, in parallel with the sensor in the back of the camera. And so by lowering or raising the front of the lens, you bring the entire subject into view with perfectly straight verticals throughout the image. Whereas if you were to lean the camera back to do the same thing, you get converging verticals and very odd perspective. So this can control that unfortunate optical distortion by setting the camera at the most appropriate height for the shot and perfectly vertical. Then you move the front element. That's the shift part of this. Now, secondly is the tilt. This is perhaps a wider range of subjects rather than just interiors, architecture, that kind of thing, as it controls depth of field. So instead of shifting the front lens on the same plane as the sensor, it swings it left to right or up or down, and by doing that you can either have the entire frame in focus with the lens wide open at f4. Of course, as most lenses are actually at their sharpest, not at their fully closed down point, but somewhere towards the middle, it means you can find the sweet spot for sharpness of that lens, set the aperture to that, and still get the entire shot completely in focus without stopping all the way down. Or the opposite, you can use the inverse of that procedure to get incredibly shallow depth of field. So you can have pictures that have that weird kind of toy-like subject of a city street looking down from above. It looks like everyone's a tiny model train set person. This is a complex lens, but it is very, very versatile, made more so by the fact it is 19mm. Historically, most tilt shift ranges haven't gone down wider than 24mm, and often there are longer versions as well, up to 85mm or even higher. But for shooting interiors, 24mm isn't often wide enough, so you're forced to use a regular wide-angle lens and correct in post. But then you lose some of that wideness, so your 19mm, for example, becomes like a 21 because you've had to push and stretch it out in Photoshop. But this gets around that by getting the entire shot correct in camera in a tight room. In fact, the only tilt shift available wider than this is the Canon 17mm. Of course, Canon only works with Canon, Nikon only works with Nikon, so you're very much limited to the system you're using. So we're starting with a quick example of the difference between the 19 and the 24mm PCE tilt shift lenses. Here we've got the 19mm, and you can see how much of the building and the foreground and the sky you can cram in to one image, and also you can see how we've got perfectly straight verticals. And if we zoom in a little bit more, the optical quality is just absolutely fantastic. Now moving on a little bit, this is the 24mm from the same position on the tripod. We've still got straight verticals, straight horizontals. However, you can see how much less of the building we're cramming in from the same position on the 24mm. Again, great optical quality. Now for a comparison of what you could be getting with an ordinary non-PCE lens, this is the Nikon 16 to 35mm f-mount lens. To give you an example, if we've still got the same angle of view, the same amount of stuff getting in, but you can see the lens distortion creeping in here on the edges. The building's not quite vertical on the outer extremities. We're fairly straight in the middle, but you can see it bowing in and distorting. You could correct this in Photoshop, but you'd start to lose areas off to the left and the right. Okay, here are some specs for you. It's Nikon f-mount only, but it will adapt to the z-mount, and it's an FX lens, meaning full frame, but it will work on some DX crop sensors as well. Maximum aperture is f4 and the minimum aperture is f32, but don't get too bogged down with that because this isn't the kind of lens you shoot wide open, and of course with that swinging front end you can change the depth of field massively regardless what the aperture is set to, and it is an electronic diaphragm. That's what the E stands for in the name. There's no aperture ring, so you have to do this through the camera, so older bodies will be stuck on f4. The closest focus is 25 centimeters, that's about 0.9 of a foot, and the field of view in FX full frame is 97 degrees, dropping to 73 degrees on a crop sensor. Now this thing is heavy, it's 885 grams, that is a big lump of stuff on the front of a camera. And it's quite large as well, and obviously that front element is massively vulnerable, so you always want to be keeping that lens cap on all the time. As I said previously, it is manual focus, it has nano crystal coated glass spherical elements, and there are 9 diaphragm blades to give you a nice round bokeh effect should you want that kind of thing. And of course, we can't fit filters to it. Now, build quality is solid and hefty. It's mostly made of metal, and it feels like you could use it as a self-defense item if pushed. The areas of the body that move, the shifting and tilting areas, are all made of metal. You've got a large rubber grip which moves very smoothly, just nicely damped, so it's not going to give you too much resistance. It's easy to turn, it's nice to turn in fact. And aperture is controlled in camera though, so there's no control for that. But despite all that solidity and heft, once you unscrew this massive, well, plastic bucket of a lens cap, you have to push the button to release it, and then it rotates and comes free. This front element is very, very exposed. You're super aware of this all the time you're taking photos with it, that it is vulnerable. Obviously there is no filter thread on this, because how are you going to screw a filter on that? So there's no way of putting like a protective UV or polarizer on that, so you can't keep it safe in any way other than putting the lens cap on as soon as you finish shooting. And also regarding filters, there's no filter slot in the back of it either. Now, to operate the tilt shift function, there are 2 fairly large dials with a lovely positive action on them. These are nicer to use than on the old 24mm, which is about 10 years older in design than the 19mm. The tilt function, which is the swing action, does have a little locking wheel on it, which means you can only send the lens side to side or up and down on that rotating arc when you have released the lock. There is, next to the T for tilt, a little gradient so you can see how many degrees you've moved it, and the shift is moved by the other longer dial further back on the lens barrel. And there again, there is a gradient for showing how many millimeters or degrees you've moved it, but there is no lock on it. It just relies on the friction of the control knob, but it does feel tight, and it has never slipped in the shots I've been using with it this last few days. It's tight enough not to need a lock, and that lack of a lock does speed up the operation of it as well. And it also has a couple of small black tabs that allow you to rotate the lens for more control, and they lock at 45-degree intervals, but you can shoot in between those points. And not only that, there's another advance on the older models in that there is a rotator tab for both the tilt and the shift planes. So you can use them independently or together for a compound movement to control the depth of field and keep your verticals vertical. Now, it is a manual focus lens, obviously, because the focusing point is so much further forward of all those intricate movements, and it's an electronic aperture. So although it will fit onto pretty much any F-mount camera and any adapted Z-mount, if you're not on a later camera, you will be stuck at f4 because the electronic shutter linkage won't be there. However, it is chunky with extra controls, and it is mobile, so certain bodies of camera will limit its motion, so you might be limited by the physical shape of some smaller bodies. However, the D5 is perfect because that big old face has got lots of room for activities. So I have come to shoot a picture of this rather interesting Huff house, which is a German modular designed, very interesting building actually. So what we've done here, to demonstrate the shift function of the lens, we've rotated the barrel to 90 degrees so we can shift up and down. The back of the camera is now set to vertical, the camera is completely square, up against the building. As you can see, let's cut to the in-camera video, it's now not completely, well, not at all centered well at all, but if we go through and start shifting this lens, we'll start seeing a difference. So the camera is vertical, we're adjusting the shift element, you can see the picture coming into shape, moving into the correct position in the frame, and then boom, perfect. Even though we're at an angle to the house, we've got nice straight verticals. Now moving on to the front of the house, same deal again, got the camera vertical, shifting the front element, just taking it up, and now we can see, again we're at a slight angle to the house, but it doesn't matter. and we're getting nice straight lines and everything fitting in perfectly. Another great image of this house. Okay, now we've got the second trick this camera can pull. Depth of field, infinite or virtually none. By tilting the camera forwards or backwards and then shifting the front of the lens to bring it straight. At just f4, at first we've got virtually nothing in focus. Then tilt the lens and suddenly we find we've got infinite focus from virtually centimetres in front of the lens all the way to infinity. And this is at f4. And again, the optical quality from this 19mm is just stunning. And go the other way, tilt in the opposite direction, we get that amazing shallow depth of field effect. Again, this is still f4, nothing's changed on the camera settings. And we've gone to virtually nothing in focus. This is a really versatile lens. And I can't keep saying this enough, the optical quality is just stunning from this lens. Okay, so the optical quality is fantastic, and what little lens distortion there is so minimal, it's barely noticeable, and so therefore very easy to correct in Photoshop without losing more than a tiny sliver of the edge of the frame. So why doesn't everyone have one of these things? Well, two reasons. First of all, it is slow to use. You cannot handhold this thing. You have to be on a tripod, and the more sturdy the tripod, the better, because the smallest of movements and wobbles from the position you set your tilt or shift into totally negates any adjustments you've just made. So it's definitely not a run and gun, and you do have to practice with these things to get the best out of them, because it's not an easy thing to use. So you have to learn the movements to get the very best out of them. And if you get it wrong, you've basically just bought yourself the world's most expensive out of focus 19mm lens. Secondly, it's not cheap. The old 24mm is about £1,800 new. But this is perhaps not as useful, certainly not as useful for interiors as the 19mm, but this is nudging double that price at £3,200. So you're not going to be buying it on a whim and not for a one-off job. Maybe you would rent it for a one-off job and then fall in love and then go buy one. But if you're a working photographer shooting interiors, buildings, landscapes, industrial, maybe product photography that demands very precise control of depth of field, then yes, this has got a place in your bag and it will deliver amazing results. So yeah, I hope this has been useful to you. If you were on the fence as to buying one, well, basically it comes down to can you afford it or not, because if you want one, I think you know you want one. It's just whether you can justify the cost of, well, £3,000 for a fairly specific lens with only a set number of uses. But if you need it, and honestly, you will not regret it. I was loaned this lens by Nikon, who actually said most people who are loaned one of these lenses do inevitably go out and buy one. And I was skeptical at first, but having used it for a few days, I can really see why. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this, and as always with YouTube stuff, if you have enjoyed this, please do hit that like and subscribe button, and tell your friends and all that other YouTubey stuff. Join me again next time when we're talking about some other camera related stuff.